Hello and welcome to a couple of brief lectures on the Torah. You might remember that last week we discussed the challenges and complexities of biblical interpretation, issues with the biblical text itself, different versions, differences in manuscripts, differences in the canon, that is the standard list of which books are in the Bible. That's when we talked about the Apocrypha. There's also differences in denominational listings, with Roman Catholics, for example, having a different Bible than Protestants. That's the Apocrypha difference again. Underlying all of this, however, is the conviction that despite the difficulties, that we have with the work of interpretation, that this is worthwhile work as we seek to better understand what is going into this complex collection of books that we call the Bible. Interpretation will help us to more deeply understand each book of the Bible, the context, the issues within each book, and how we may grow in faith through interpretation. The Bible remains a powerful and deeply inspirational collection of books. We saw how the very construction of the Bible as we have it today emerged out of the traumatic experiences of the people of Israel who had survived exile and were attempting to create a new religious, political, and cultural identity. The scribes who gathered and edited the stories drawn from people's lives over many centuries drew those stories together to give this people guidance, inspiration, and hope. They did this around a book that preserved the stories of defeat, the struggles of the people to be faithful, and differences in their stories of origin and development. They thus encouraged themselves, and they now encourage us to have an ongoing conversation around this collection of books, all aimed at drawing people together in a vibrant, shared life where difference led to discussion rather than to domination. We can be faithful to this project, to the Bible's own complexity and raising of questions, not by seeking to impose one meaning, just one interpretation, but by considering the distinctive context and issues and themes within each book, and from that, engaging in mutual discernment about what the biblical text might have meant in the past and what they might mean for us now. So with all that in mind, we turn to Genesis. Again, last week we talked about some of these things. We asked that question about why begin with Genesis? Why not begin with Exodus, the call of the people out of enslavement in Egypt and becoming one people through those formative years of the desert? Well, as we discovered, the Bible begins with Genesis for a very good reason. That Genesis is written after the people had lost the covenantal Davidic kingship, the temple, and Jerusalem. The exile had happened in Babylonia. So the writing of Genesis is a kind of act of imaginative resistance, as we drew from Rodney Sadler in his commentary in the Africana Bible. An act of imaginative resistance. It's the asserting of a corrective theo-historiographical narrative that reminds an oppressed group that they have a God who created them in God's own image. That they were created for a distinctive purpose. They have a backstory that predates the nothingness, the nobodyhood, the thingification that ideologically had facilitated their enslavement. So Genesis is this great corrective in the assertion of the dignity of human beings created in the image of God, and the rooting of the story of Israel in the patriarchal story of God's choosing Abraham. So that we got as we looked through the creation stories in Genesis, chapter 1 and chapter 2, the two different creation stories. With the first story, we talked about the four-document hypothesis that's reflecting the priestly authorship. With the second creation account in chapter 2, more of an Elohist tradition supporting the creation and holding on to of that story. And those two stories are stitched together by those later editors who believe both of these stories contain important truths about God and God's relationship to the people. We talked briefly also about women in that creation account. Eve described as Ezer, helper, which is not a subservient term. That's a term that's used to speak of God in relationship to Israel. We talked about Adam, the earth creature, and then the creation of two, of man and woman. So we also notice this feminine language for God in Exodus 34, 6-7, for example. God's character described as compassionate, rakhum or rachamin, coming from the Hebrew word for womb, rakim. So this fits with what is in Genesis, the high estimation of Eve. But we're going to see as we go into these other books that the place and the dignity of women is something that's contested biblically. There's no doubt that much of the Old Testament is very patriarchal, demeaning of women and keeping them sort of in their place, which is second place compared to men. But we'll see other texts as we go through the whole Bible that have a much higher estimation of women and a deep concern for the well-being of women. This is obviously an issue in today's society as well. And so the biblical text gets used in a variety of ways. And part of what we need to wrestle with is which of those ways is more authentic to the overall thrust of the Bible. So we also talk some about the origins of the racial curse, the curse of Ham in Genesis 9:18-27, and saw how ridiculous that interpretation is. And yet it had this horrific power for so many centuries. So there's a lot at stake in biblical interpretation, and we want to make sure that we're doing the best job possible as we go forward. So we talked about the Joseph story and God's favoring of those whom the world disfavors. And this is going to be an ongoing emphasis within biblical texts. So that was our review of Genesis, but now we're moving into Exodus, and from there we'll go to Leviticus, and we'll have Numbers and Deuteronomy. We're trying to do a lot here. So we're going to move fairly quickly with the notion that we're getting kind of an overview, and then next Monday when we meet in class, any questions that you have about what you heard today in this short lecture, we will address when we gather again as a class. So, major issues and themes in the interpretation of Exodus, the birth of this nation, this people of God. Interestingly, the book of Exodus begins with a genealogy. I don't know about you, but I struggle with these genealogies. It seems kind of boring. And so we have to ask, though, if we struggle with the text, what's the purpose of these genealogies? Well, here it's important to name the continuity and the foundational nature of this book of Exodus, the experience of Exodus, which is not limited to the people who left Egypt. Remember, the Bible is trying to say, these people who left Egypt are now us today. Not us as 21st century Americans, but us, those Jews who were drawing the books of the Bible together, 7th century. So we're trying to see that there's this continuity between the people of the Exodus and the people of Israel. There's lots of controversy around this story of the leaving of slavery in Egypt, questions about whether or not it's historical, who left Egypt when. I think those are fine things to look into, but we're not going to waste or spend a lot of our time thinking about those things. We're going to be more concerned with this fundamental truth that comes through the book of Exodus, which is God hears the cries of the oppressed and responds with liberating action. That's from the very beginning, after the genealogies. Very quickly, we read that God has heard the cries of the Israelites in slavery, and God is going to act. Also in Exodus is the importance of remembering. Exodus chapter 12, verse 14, talking about the Passover. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Through your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. And that's not only in Exodus 12, 24 through 27, it's also in Exodus 13, 3 to 10. So this remembrance is crucial. Even before they're out of Egypt, they are being told to remember this day. And it acknowledges who God is and who the people are. Exodus 22. So we need to remember who we are and whose we are. And God is sort of like a mama who says, I brought you into this world and I can take you out. So this is a God who is powerful, liberating, and calling the people to account. So let's go into a few details here. Exodus chapter 1, 1 through 14, the first story of resistance is a little backstory on how Israel gets enslaved, but then very quickly moves to the midwives who are in resistance to Pharaoh, who has decreed that all the the Israelite male children shall be killed. He's fearful for his power. We hear some echoes of that in the New Testament with Herod in the birth of Jesus. So Pharaoh, though, his rule there gets subverted by these midwives. Keep in mind that Pharaoh is standing in here as in the story, stands in for any leader of any empire, including critique of Israel's own kings, which will be used later, for example, critiquing David and Solomon. So importantly, Pharaoh should be regarded as any ruler. And so the resistance of the midwives is about resistance today as well. The second story of resistance is Moses' mama saves him in defiance of Pharaoh. Moses goes through the water of deliverance, foreshadowing Israel going through the Red Sea and then across the Jordan. So Moses is discovered and raised by Pharaoh's daughter. She heard the child crying, takes pity upon him. Think here about Exodus 3:7 with God hearing the cries of the people of Israel. So this is kind of this equation of Moses with Israel gets going pretty quickly in the book of Exodus. So there's those acts of resistance, and then we hear God hearing the cry of the Israelites for release, Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 24. God hears the cry of those enslaved, and that's what leads God to the call of Moses. Important stories in there. We're going to kind of go quickly, though, to Moses coming to Pharaoh. What does Moses ask of Pharaoh? Let my people go. We know that from the famous spiritual song. But it's not just let my people go. It's let my people go so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. God is saying this. This gets repeated numerous times through Exodus. Exodus 5:1, but also 3:18, 4:22, 7:16, 8:1, 8:20, 9:1, 9:13, 10:3. So the freedom here is to not work, to be liberated to have Sabbath. You know you're a slave, when you don't have Sabbath, when you don't take Sabbath. So what's Pharaoh's response to this, let my people go? He makes things worse for the Israelites. His heart is hardened. Of course it's hardened. He's fearing the loss of the slaves, part of the base of his economic power, which is tied to his political power. So he's not going to let these slaves go. He wants to hold on to them for his own self-interest, for his power. So Pharaoh's heart is hardened by fear, by the desire to remain in power, to dominate the Israelites. So he can't let them go. So when he is forced, finally, to let them go through these plagues, the 10 plagues, we see God's work in powerfully confronting this imperial ruler, Pharaoh. So there's all sorts of great themes in Exodus. We want to talk about some of those next week. God's the creator and the redeemer, the liberator. All God's children are fully human. All God's children can expect deliverance. God's deliverance is spiritual, it's political, it's economic, it's physical. God is faithful and just, and so delivers the people. Once Israel is out in the wilderness, then we have this long part of Exodus, in which famously people say Israel got out of Egypt, but then they had to get the Egypt out of Israel. So there's a lot of complaining and backsliding that goes on with the Israelites. It's hard to have the discipline and the accountability to be free. And think again, this context of this book, it's not just a story about people in the past. This is a story that's about what does it take in the present to be free. For the people of Israel in that 7th century BC, how do they get free from exile and recreate themselves as a people? So this is the covenantal language that comes in to be God's people. They are God's chosen people, and then they are called to account because they are God's chosen people. This doesn't place them above all others. It places them in this position of responsibility. One of the things that the authors point out in our textbook is that the covenant that Yahweh establishes with Israel at Mount Sinai has parallels with the Hittite vassal treaties. So you can look at that in your text in more detail. They point out what those what those similarities are. It's also, though, important to point out a key difference. This covenant is based upon upon God's gracious acts towards Israel. So God frees the people of Israel and then calls them to account. How do you remain free? How do you remain a people? And so it's not that law shapes the relationship of God to Israel. It's the other way around, that God's relationship with Israel is what shapes the law. So the law is the way in which Israel will live out in faithfulness to their God who has been and remains faithful. There's all sorts of other things that we can talk about here, but we're moving on to the book of Leviticus suddenly. So Leviticus is not a book that people read generally for inspiration and consolation. It's a book of laws, but it flows graciously out of the book of Exodus. How will the people live now as the people of God? The law structures just relationships with God, with each other, and with all of God's creation. So think of these laws as affirming a very important point, which is that a relationship with God permeates all of life. It's not just about what somebody does on Sunday. It's also about how people live in terms of their sexual relationships, in terms of their relationships with their workers, in their political and economic relationships, all need to be infused by this faithfulness to God. So chapter 19 of Leviticus is really the key to understanding the whole book, because Leviticus builds towards chapter 19 and then kind of recedes. So chapters 1 to 7, sacrifices; 8 to 10, ordination of priests; 11 to 15, the practice of purity. So a little side note, Deuteronomy 15:11 says, "Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land." This is what Jesus is referring to when he says, "The poor you will always have with you." Jesus is referring us back to Deuteronomy 15. So it's not an excuse like, the poor you always have with you, so screw the poor. No, it's the poor are always here. Therefore, I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. Okay, that's a little bit from chapter 15. Chapter 16 through 17 is about purity and atonement. Chapter 19, purity, that is the holiness. You're called to be holy as God is holy. Now live it out in these just relationships. So after that, of course, comes accountability. Chapter 20, what happens if you don't follow the law? Punishments. Chapters 21 through 26, purity and feasts. How do we celebrate this ongoing relationship with God all through the year, a kind of liturgical calendar? So there's much to think about in Leviticus. Think if we go to this chapter 19 of Leviticus, which starts out, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." This is about how do we imitate the goodness of God. Chapter 19, verse 9, gleaning. Don't take everything for yourself. 9:11, prohibition of theft. 9:12, don't swear falsely. So speak the truth in our mouths. 19:13, fraud and wage theft. Don't steal from others. 19:14, the treatment of the handicapped. Treat them with respect. Respect their vulnerability. Chapter 19:15, justice shall be equitable. It needs to be fair. People need to be treated according to their dignity as human beings made in the image of God. Slander, 19:16. Don't be talking poorly of others. They're made in the image of God. 19:17 to 19. Love of neighbor as yourself is what Jesus is going to say. This sums up the whole law, right? Love God and love neighbor. 19:19 and following. Keeping the laws so that life is orderly, so we can flourish. 1932, treat the aged with dignity. 1933 to 34, just treatment of strangers and aliens. And note again the basis for this. The alien who resides with you, shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. 1935 to 37, honesty in business relationships. 1921, going back a little bit, the law of the talion. This is a big one, the eye for the eye and the tooth for the tooth. Compare that to the Babylonian law code upon which it was based. So it's right there in the Code of Hammurabi. If a man has destroyed the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. If he has broken another man's bone, they shall break his bone. See? The Israelites are drawing upon the context in which they live. But the Babylonian law is complicated by the fact that crimes against those of different social classes required different punishment. You harm a person above you, you get harmed more. So that's prohibited by the Bible. So note the Bible is going back to the sort of Genesis conviction that we are all made in the image of God. So justice is not different for the rich or the poor. It's supposed to be the same. Also, the Babylonian law code expanded this vengeance so that you could do vengeance upon the entire family of the offender. So we need to note that the law of the talion in in Leviticus here, is actually a restriction on vengeance, not an endorsement of it. This is what Jesus will draw upon when he further restricts the law of the talion. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But he says, you are to love your enemy. So he's taking it sort of this divine, logically divine conclusion of restriction to elimination of vengeance. Leviticus 15 and Leviticus 25 is the famous sabbatical / jubilee year. So the Bible in Leviticus is recognizing that inequality happens as wealth is sort of redistributed upward in most societies. And Leviticus saying every certain number of years, it needs to be redistributed so that we get equality again. Leviticus 20, rules of warfare. Note two things here. One is that all-out war is not the way of war set out in Leviticus. Rather, there are restrictions, moral restrictions on the practice of war. And second of all, that victory in war is dependent upon God, not upon the power and the skill of the warriors and their military might. So that's Leviticus in a nutshell. And again, we come back next week with questions and concerns. We move on to major themes and issues in the book of Numbers. Big question we might ask here is, must the oppressed become oppressors? As Israel is moving out of slavery through the desert, what kind of society are they going to create? So the organization of the book of Numbers, it's kind of a repeat in some ways of the book of Exodus. But there are differences because we're getting the editing, the retelling of some of these stories. So section 1 of Numbers, from Mount Sinai to the death of the Exodus generation, Numbers 1 through 25. A census opens this section in chapter 1. In fact, the book is named for the census, the numbering. Numbers, where'd that come from? Because the people are being numbered. And then section 2, from the birth of the new generation to the Israelite encampment on the plains of Moab. And a census begins that section too. Got to pay attention to those censuses because they're telling us that there's a reaffirmation of who counts as the people of God. So why is a census so important besides that point? Well, you need to do a census for three things: taxes, military preparation, and distribution of land. And those three things are going to be seen then in Numbers right off the bat. They're counting everyone able to go to war. Numbers chapter 1, verse 20, chapter 1, 22, chapter 1, 24, also verse 26, verse 28, verse 30, verse 32, verse 34, verse 36, 38, 40, 42, 45. And in 26 too, everyone in Israel able to go to war. That's the second census. So each tribe is represented. Purpose is to show that everybody is going to contribute to the military of Israel, except the Levites, whose job is the tabernacle, dealing with the tabernacle, the very presence of God in the people of Israel. They get counted, but not for military purposes. So that's military. Tithing is taxes. Numbers chapter 29, verse 35 through chapter 30, verse 1, how this tithing is going to go on. And then finally, distribution of land. Look at Numbers chapter 34, and 35. So some questions as we go through the book of Numbers. There are echoes of Exodus all over the place. The Passover at Sinai. Think of the Passover back in Egypt. That's in Numbers chapter 9, the Passover. All sorts of complaining that goes on. The complaining of the people in Numbers 11. They complain about food in that chapter, like in Exodus. They complain about the report from the spies who are looking out forward to going into the promised land, Numbers 14. They are all concerned about that they're not going to be powerful enough to enter this promised land. They complain about no water, Numbers chapter 20, at the waters of Meribah. And that's where we get the explanation for why Moses will not enter the promised land, because he didn't trust God to provide the water, Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. And they complain about it taking too long, about taking the long way around, Numbers 21, verses 1 to 9, and that's where we get this great story of the bronze serpent. So that's a lot of complaining. Sounds a lot like what was going on in Exodus. The people are always being tested. Are they going to get the Egypt out of them now that they're out of Egypt? Very much like in Exodus. Key events, there are various battles in which they're trying to move towards the promised land. And what we get is these very disturbing passages of it's genocide. We're going to get more of that as we move into the book of Joshua as well. So we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. There's also various laws stitched into that narrative of the journey. So Numbers 15, there's rules about offerings. Numbers 18, rules for priests, Levites. Numbers 28 through 30, rules for offerings after Joshua is appointed as a successor of Moses. There's Numbers 35, verse 9, the cities of refuge. It's like, where do people go who have done wrong, who have murdered? They can take refuge in a city. There's the murder and revenge laws, or we hear again the law of the talion. Interestingly, in Numbers chapter 35, verse 30, very careful legislation about testimony in death penalty cases. So this is not just this endorsement of vengeance again. It's a restriction. It's careful. So there's also the great story in Numbers of Balak and Balaam, the donkey, Balaam's donkey. So Balak is the summons Balaam to curse Israel, and this wonderful story of the talking donkey who will not curse Israel. So again, this is where we think about interpretation here. Is this meant to be a fun parable of sorts and a mockery of this king? He can't even get a donkey to curse Israel. So there's fun stuff in the Bible that should make us laugh. It's intended to be humor. What's not humorous that's in Numbers is the oppression of women. Patriarchy comes through pretty strongly in this book. Numbers chapter 5, verse 5 through 31. This whole long thing about the test of a woman's fidelity to her husband, and if she has cheated on her husband, she shall be rendered barren. Then Miriam and Aaron criticized the leadership of Moses and his Cushite wife. Miriam's punished with leprosy, but Aaron is not. Yet again, though, the people can't move forward until Miriam is healed. So the issue behind that is who speaks for God, which is a big issue that we get for the people of Israel in their present as these texts are being edited. Who speaks for God? The prophetic voice, the king. Who speaks for God? And that, so the question's being raised through these stories. There are other stories that are disturbing in terms of how women are treated. We'll look at Numbers 25, the women of Baal Peor and an unnamed Midianite woman. So their foreignness and their enticing men into prostitution to be with them as prostitutes, is used as justification to slaughter them. It's very disturbing kinds of texts. Also, the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers 27, 1 to 11, and 36, 1 to 12. There's 5 audacious women. Their father had died in the wilderness. They say, shouldn't we get his share of the land? They do initially, but then in Numbers 27, or excuse me, in Numbers 36, it gets reversed, and they don't get the land. So what we can see in these texts is that this is where we really start to encounter the question of these troubling texts in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. There are 3 kinds we might point out. Texts that offend our moral sensibilities, our convictions, like the horrible treatment of women, genocide. If we're not offended by those things, then there's something wrong with us. Texts that conflict with our view of God. Does God really command genocide? Is God as harsh a judge and punisher as comes off in some of these texts? And then finally, texts that have been and are used to harm other people. Justifications for the exploitation and oppression of women. Anti-foreigner texts. Holy war texts as rationalizations for genocide. Those were used against Native Americans. So we have to ask, how do we deal with these troubling texts in the Old Testament? So I'm going to draw upon a scholar by the name of Eric A. Siebert. He has a really fine book called Enjoying the Old Testament, a creative guide to encountering the Scripture. And he gives us some advice. He says, first of all, let's be honest about what bothers us. We should be bothered by what we're reading in certain sections of the Bible. If we're not bothered, our moral consciousness is kind of dead. It's good to ask questions. We don't have to go with one interpretation. So ask questions, be bothered, and say, hey, that doesn't make sense to me. What's going on here? It's fine to criticize these books of the Old Testament, these passages in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures that don't jibe with our sense of morality. For people who are Christians, we can critique it from the standpoint of Jesus Christ. We might say we have a Christocentric hermeneutical key here, so that we stand from the standpoint of Jesus and say, that's just not right. So we have that principle of critique as well. It's also, we can note that in the Hebrew Bible itself, there are people who critique what they understand to be not a good approach to God. Abraham does that, Moses does it, Job certainly does it, the psalmists do it. So there's criticism already in the text itself. To be critical is not to be unfaithful. In fact, it's a deeper sign of faith that we're willing to ask those questions and to go deeper into these texts. Well, so what's our criteria for this kind of criticism? We might have 3. A rule of love. Does this passage, this text, our interpretation enhance our love for God and others or not? If it doesn't, not good. Rule of justice. Does this passage, text, interpretation help to set things right, lead to human flourishing? If it does, great. If it doesn't, problematic. And finally, a rule of respect for human life. Does this passage, text, interpretation respect and value all people? So 3 good rules that we can have here. A rule of love, a rule of justice, and a rule of respect for all people to help guide our critique and our work in interpretation. Keep in mind that not every portrayal of God in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, accurately reflects God's character. And there are going to be arguments back and forth, even within the text, about just what is God's character. Israel doesn't always get God right. Remember, again, for Christians at least, Christ is the hermeneutical key. So we do need to wrestle with these texts. As he says, don't let them go until they bless you. Dig deeper with these troublesome texts. Sometimes there's more going on than just the surface bad stuff. What else may we learn? Sometimes what we learn is that this is not the way of God. So we want to ask some hard questions. We need to find ways to use these troublesome texts constructively. First, we can learn from the negative example. We name what is troubling and identify how we need to avoid doing the same today. Second, we can look for positive insights and key questions raised by these troubling texts. For example, we might see that violence leads to more violence. So let's not do that. Does the text reflect the cultural context more than it reflects God? Good question that we need to ask. And third, let the trouble make us go deeper into the questions around war, genocide, violence, women, oppression of those who are different, etc. And then finally, fourth, let the Bible interpret the Bible. Bring those troublesome texts into conversations with other texts in the Bible. Sure, there's patriarchy, but there are also stories that are affirming the dignity of women. Put them in argument with each other. Remember, the Bible doesn't speak with just one voice. We have all these books, and those who brought these books together were basically saying to us, get involved with the conversation. So that's Numbers. And now Deuteronomy. What's in the name? Deuteronomy. The Septuagint from the Hebrew that gets translated for us, Deuteronomy, it means second law. The second body of law. This is the second telling of many of the laws given earlier in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. So we're hearing them again, and we might be asking, why? Why do we have to read all through this all again? Well, because there's going to be some editorial changes to address the concerns of the people who made sure that Deuteronomy was kept as a book. So there's 4 sections in this book. First, the events from Moses' life and the Exodus redone, chapters 1 through 11. The law, chapters 12 through 26. Blessings and curses related to following or not following the law, chapters 27 through 28. And then Moses' long farewell, chapters 29 through 34. And that's where we get this exhortation to choose life. See, I've set before you this day life and death. Choose life, therefore. Deuteronomy 30, 15 to 20. If you follow the laws, you'll flourish. If you don't follow the laws, you won't flourish. You'll get death. Then Moses sings a really nice song towards the end of Deuteronomy, and then finally the death of Moses in chapter 34 before he gets to the promised land. What's going on with Deuteronomy? What's the context? Most scholars say it really reflects the concerns of 7th century BC Israel. So it's going to share a lot of the context of that time. See page 95, for example, in our text about the treaty documents being reflected in the legal organization within Israel. So we'll come back to some of that next week when we gather, but there are changes, there are reinterpretations that are going on. Example, Deuteronomy 14, chapter 14, verse 21, permits the selling of meat to a resident alien from an animal that died of natural causes. That goes directly against Leviticus chapter 17, verse 15. Deuteronomy 16, chapter 16, verses 13 to 15, permits women to participate in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths. That's contrary to Exodus chapter 23, 17. See more in your text on page 98. So there's a drawing upon and an adapting and an editing of previous material in those previous books, reflecting the concerns of the people who are doing the final editing of this text. So that's what we want to think about in in Deuteronomy how that editing is going on and for what purpose. But there's also this great theme of oneness in Deuteronomy. It's a kind of drawing together of the Torah. What do we have in the Torah? This is our last book. We have one God who calls these people to be one people, who live on God's one land, one place, and they follow one Torah, one way. That's Deuteronomy. It's saying we're organized around this call of God to be the people of God that's lived out through the law of God. But remember, the choice of this people comes first, not the law that's coming first. So, conclusion, what's going on in Deuteronomy? It's a recap, so to speak, to say, what are we going to be? Are we victims, or are we going to be proactive and create ourselves as a people? Are we going to choose life, or are we going to choose death? So this is what's going on in Deuteronomy. It's recapping really what we've seen in the previous 4 books, and it's editing it for the context in which they live now. Woo! That's a lot. Thanks for hanging in there. I will see you next Monday. Make sure you do your reflections, your assignment, and bring your questions for next week.